Steam was practically coming out of Mr. Gregory Stone's ears as he stood in my doorway, his face red with rage, shouting, "I don't care about your excuses anymore, Victoria. Pay the full rent increase right now, or pack your bags and get out of my building." That's when I calmly reached into my folder and handed him a thick stack of papers, saying, "Mr. Stone, I think you should read these before making any more threats." He snatched them from my hand, barely glancing at the top page before throwing them back at me and screaming, "I don't have time for your paperwork games." What he didn't know was that those papers contained documentation that would not only destroy his illegal rent scheme, but land him in federal court and cost him his entire property empire. I'm Victoria George, and I'm 34 years old. I work as a freelance paralegal here in Seattle, Washington, specializing in housing law and tenant rights cases. For the past 3 years, I've been living in a small one-bedroom apartment in the Capitol Hill neighborhood, paying what I thought was fair rent for a decent place in the city. What I didn't realize until recently was that my landlord, Mr. Stone, had been systematically violating federal housing laws, and my background in legal research was about to become his worst nightmare. Mr. Stone is 58 years old and owns 12 rental properties throughout Seattle, making his living off what he considers passive income from tenants like me. His property manager, Beth Martinez, who's 41, handles most of the day-to-day operations, but Mr. Stone personally handles what he calls problem tenants, anyone who questions his practices or challenges his authority. Living next door to me is Kevin Park, who's 29 and works as a software developer. Kevin had been experiencing the same illegal treatment from Mr. Stone, but unlike me, he didn't have the legal knowledge to understand his rights. To understand how this confrontation came about, you need to know about the housing situation in Seattle and how landlords like Mr. Stone have been taking advantage of the rental market crisis. Seattle's rapid growth and tech boom have created a housing shortage that gives unscrupulous landlords tremendous power over tenants who are desperate to find affordable places to live. I'd moved into my Capitol Hill apartment 3 years earlier, attracted by the reasonable rent of $1,800 per month for a one-bedroom unit in a neighborhood known for its artistic community and walkable lifestyle. The apartment was nothing fancy, a 1,960 seconds building that clearly needed updates, but it was clean, safe, and within my budget as a freelance paralegal whose income fluctuated depending on available projects. My work as a paralegal focused specifically on housing law, working with attorney Susan Wright, who's 52 and runs a practice that represents low-income tenants in disputes with landlords. Through my job, I'd become an expert in tenant rights, federal housing regulations, and the legal requirements that landlords must follow. I'd helped prepare cases involving illegal rent increases, habitability violations, and discrimination, but I'd never imagined I'd need that knowledge to defend my own housing situation. The problems with Mr. Stone began about 18 months after I moved in. What started as minor maintenance issues, a leaky faucet, a broken window latch, escalated into a pattern of neglect and hostility when I began requesting repairs in writing and citing specific sections of Seattle's housing code. Mr. Stone clearly didn't appreciate tenants who knew their rights and could articulate them using legal terminology. The first major red flag came when Mr. Stone announced a rent increase of $400 per month, claiming it was due to neighborhood improvements and increased property values. The increase would have brought my rent to $2,200, which was significantly higher than comparable units in the area. When I researched Seattle's rent control ordinances, I discovered that Mr. Stone's proposed increase exceeded the legal limits for existing tenants. When I politely informed Mr. Stone that his rent increase violated city regulations, his response was immediate and aggressive. "I don't care what you think you know about the law," he told me during a tense phone conversation. "I own this building, and I set the prices. If you don't like it, you can find somewhere else to live." That conversation revealed Mr. Stone's fundamental misunderstanding of landlord-tenant law and his belief that property ownership gave him unlimited power over his tenants. It also motivated me to begin documenting every interaction we had and researching his compliance with various housing regulations. What I discovered was shocking. Mr. Stone's building violations included multiple safety code infractions, failure to provide required disclosures to tenants, and a pattern of discriminatory practices that violated both local and federal fair housing laws. More seriously, I found evidence that he'd been systematically overcharging tenants for utilities, pocketing the difference between what he collected and what he actually paid to the city. The utility scam was particularly egregious. Mr. Stone had been charging each tenant $150 per month for water, sewer, and garbage, claiming these were his actual costs divided among the building's 8 units. When I obtained copies of the city utility bills through a public records request, I discovered that Mr. Stone's total monthly utility costs were only $400, meaning he was collecting $1,200 from tenants while paying $400 to the city, a profit of $800 per month from fraudulent utility charges. I also discovered that Mr. Stone had never obtained the required rental licenses for several of his properties, including my building. Operating rental properties without proper licenses violated multiple city ordinances and exposed him to significant fines and legal liability. The most disturbing discovery was evidence that Mr. Stone had been discriminating against families with children and people of certain ethnic backgrounds. I found online rental advertisements that included illegal preferences and spoke with former tenants who described discriminatory treatment they'd experienced while living in Mr. Stone's properties. Armed with this information, I began working with my boss, attorney Susan Wright, to build a comprehensive case against Mr. Stone. We discovered that his violations weren't limited to my building. They extended across his entire rental portfolio, suggesting a systematic pattern of illegal conduct that had been ongoing for years. The final straw came when Mr. Stone announced another rent increase, this one even larger than the first. He claimed that all tenants needed to pay an additional $500 per month starting immediately, or face eviction proceedings. When several tenants, including my neighbor Kevin, came to me for advice, I realized that Mr. Stone's illegal practices were affecting dozens of people across his properties. The confrontation that would change everything began on a rainy Tuesday morning in October when Mr. Stone showed up at my apartment unannounced, demanding immediate payment of the illegal rent increase he'd imposed. I was working from home, preparing legal documents for one of Susan's cases, when I heard aggressive knocking on my door. "Victoria George, Mr. Stone called through the door. "I know you're in there. We need to talk about your rent situation right now." When I opened the door, Mr. Stone pushed his way into my apartment without invitation, clearly agitated and more aggressive than I'd ever seen him. Beth Martinez, his property manager, followed behind him, looking uncomfortable with his behavior but unwilling to contradict her boss. "Mr. Stone," I said calmly, "you can't enter my apartment without proper notice. Seattle law requires 24-hour written notice for non-emergency." "Don't quote the law to me," he interrupted angrily. "I own this building, and I'll enter any unit whenever I need to. You're 3 weeks behind on your rent payment." "I'm not behind on my rent," I replied firmly. "I've paid the legal amount according to Seattle's rent control ordinances. Your demanded increase violates multiple city regulations." Mr. Stone's face was getting redder by the minute. "I'm sick of your legal mumbo-jumbo. You're either going to pay what I'm asking, or you're going to find somewhere else to live. I've got people lined up to rent this place for twice what you're paying." Beth Martinez looked increasingly uncomfortable as Mr. Stone's behavior escalated. "Mr. Stone," she said quietly, "maybe we should discuss this in the office." "No," he snapped. "I'm done negotiating with tenants who think they know more about real estate than I do. Victoria, you have until Friday to pay the full amount I'm requesting. plus a late fee of $200, or I'm starting eviction proceedings. Mr. Stone, I said, pulling out the folder I'd been preparing for weeks, before you make any more threats, I think you should review some information I've gathered about your rental practices. I handed him the thick stack of papers documentation of every violation I'd discovered, copies of city utility bills showing his fraudulent charges, evidence of discriminatory rental practices, and a detailed analysis of how his rent increases violated Seattle housing law. Mr. Stone barely glanced at the first page before throwing the papers back at me. I don't have time for your paperwork games. I don't care what you think you've found. I'm the landlord here, and what I say goes. The papers scattered across my apartment floor documents that represented weeks of research and analysis, evidence that could expose years of illegal practices and protect dozens of current and future tenants from exploitation. Mr. Stone, I said, kneeling to gather the scattered papers, I strongly recommend that you read these documents carefully. They contain information about federal housing violations that could result in serious legal consequences for you. Federal violations? He laughed mockingly. You're a paralegal who can't even afford to pay her rent on time. You don't know anything about federal law. That's when Beth Martinez picked up one of the papers that had fallen near her feet. As she read it, her expression changed dramatically. Mr. Stone, she said quietly, I think you should look at this. I don't need to look at anything, he replied dismissively. Victoria is trying to intimidate me with legal threats because she can't afford to live here anymore. But Beth was reading more of the documents, and her face was getting paler with each page. Mr. Stone, these papers document utility billing discrepancies, licensing violations, and fair housing complaints. This is serious. Mr. Stone snatched the papers from Beth's hands and began reading them more carefully. As he read, I watched his expression change from dismissive anger to confusion to growing alarm. Where did you get this information? He demanded. Public records requests, city databases, and tenant interviews, I replied calmly. All obtained legally through standard research methods. This is harassment, Mr. Stone said, but his voice lacked its earlier confidence. You're trying to create problems where none exist. Mr. Stone, I said firmly, these aren't created problems. These are documented violations of city and federal law. Your utility billing scheme alone constitutes fraud, and your discriminatory rental practices violate the Fair Housing Act. Beth was now reading over Mr. Stone's shoulder, and I could see the panic in her eyes as she realized the scope of the violations documented in my research. Some of this information is from properties I don't even manage, she whispered to Mr. Stone. How did she get access to rental applications and tenant communications from other buildings? I work for attorney Susan Wright, I explained. We represent tenants in housing discrimination cases, and several of your former tenants have filed complaints about their treatment in your properties. That revelation hit Mr. Stone like a physical blow. He'd assumed he was dealing with a troublesome tenant who was trying to avoid paying rent. Now he was learning that he was facing a legal professional who had been systematically investigating his business practices and building a case against him. The moment Mr. Stone realized the true scope of what he was facing was visible on his face. The papers he was holding weren't just tenant complaints or minor grievances. They were evidence of systematic violations that could result in federal charges, massive fines, and the loss of his rental properties. You're working with a lawyer? He asked, and for the first time since I'd known him, his voice sounded uncertain. Attorney Susan Wright specializes in tenant rights and fair housing violations, I confirmed. She's representing several of your former tenants in ongoing cases against you. Beth Martinez looked like she wanted to disappear. As Mr. Stone's property manager, she'd been involved in implementing many of the practices that my research had exposed as illegal. Her liability in any legal proceedings would depend on how much she'd known about the violations and whether she'd participated willingly in the schemes. "What exactly are you accusing me of?" Mr. Stone demanded, though his aggressive posture was beginning to crumble. I walked him through the major violations systematically. Utility billing fraud, where you've been collecting $1,200 monthly from tenants while paying the city only $400. Operating rental properties without required licenses, implementing rent increases that violate Seattle's tenant protection ordinances, discriminatory rental practices that violate federal fair housing law. With each item I listed, Mr. Stone's face grew paler. These weren't minor infractions that could be resolved with small fines. They were serious violations that could result in criminal charges and civil liability. The utility billing issue alone, I continued, represents theft of approximately $9,600 per year from tenants in this building, and similar amounts from your other properties. Over the 3 years I've been tracking this, you've fraudulently collected nearly $30,000 from this building alone. Beth Martinez was now openly reading through my documentation, and what she found was clearly alarming her. "Mr. Stone," she said quietly, "some of these rental applications have discriminatory comments written in the margins. Comments about families with children and ethnic backgrounds. Those are just notes about tenant preferences, Mr. Stone said defensively, but his voice carried no conviction. "Mr. Stone," I said, "refusing to rent to families with children violates the Fair Housing Act. Making rental decisions based on the ethnic background violates federal civil rights law. These practices expose you to lawsuits, fines, and criminal charges." That's when Mr. Stone made his biggest mistake of the day. Instead of backing down and trying to negotiate a resolution, he doubled down on his aggressive approach. "I don't care what your lawyer friend thinks she can prove," he said, his voice rising again. "I'm still the owner of this building, and I'm still telling you to pay the rent I'm asking for or get out." "Mr. Stone," I said calmly, "I don't think you understand the situation you're in. The documentation I've provided shows a pattern of federal housing violations that could result in the seizure of your properties and criminal charges against you personally." "You're bluffing," he replied, but I could see the doubt in his eyes. That's when I pulled out my phone and made a call that would change everything. "Susan," I said when my boss answered, "It's Victoria. Mr. Stone is here demanding illegal rent payments and refusing to address the housing violations we've documented. I think it's time to move forward with the federal complaint." The conversation that followed was brief but decisive. Susan confirmed that she'd been working with federal housing authorities to investigate Mr. Stone's properties and that my research had provided crucial evidence for their case. She also informed me that housing inspectors would be conducting surprise inspections of all of Mr. Stone's properties within the next 48 hours. When I hung up the phone, Mr. Stone and Beth were staring at me with expressions of absolute shock. "Federal complaint?" Beth asked weakly. "The Department of Housing and Urban Development takes fair housing violations very seriously," I explained. "When patterns of discrimination and fraudulent practices are documented across multiple properties, they initiate comprehensive investigations that can result in the seizure of assets and criminal prosecution." Mr. Stone was now reading through my documentation more carefully, and I could see him beginning to understand the magnitude of his legal exposure. The papers he'd initially dismissed as paperwork games contained evidence that could destroy his business and potentially land him in federal prison. What happened next was one of the most satisfying moments of my professional life. Mr. Stone, who had entered my apartment an hour earlier threatening eviction and demanding illegal rent payments, was now sitting at my kitchen table with his head in his hands, finally understanding that he was facing federal investigation for years of systematic housing violations. "How long have you been working on this?" he asked quietly. "About 18 months, I replied. "Since you first threatened me for questioning your illegal rent increase." Beth Martinez was now fully reading through my documentation, and what she discovered was clearly devastating. "Mr. Stone," she said, her voice shaking, "this documents utility fraud going back 5 years. If these numbers are accurate, we've been stealing from tenants for, it's hundreds of thousands of dollars." "I never told you to steal anything," Mr. Stone said desperately. "Those utility charges were legitimate fees." "Mr. Stone," I interjected, "charging tenants $150 each for utilities while paying the city only $50 per unit is fraud, regardless of how you justify it to yourself." That's when my phone rang again. It was Daniel Rodriguez, a housing inspector with the city of Seattle, calling to inform me that they'd received my complaint and would be conducting an immediate inspection of Mr. Stone's building. "Mr. Rodriguez," I said, putting the call on speaker so Mr. Stone could hear, "I'm here with Mr. Stone right now. He's demanding rent payments that violate Seattle housing ordinances, and he's threatening eviction for my refusal to pay illegal increases." "Mr. George," Daniel replied, "we've reviewed your documentation and we're issuing immediate citations for multiple code violations. Mr. Stone, if you're listening, you need to understand that threatening tenants for refusing to pay illegal rent increases is itself a violation of tenant protection laws." The conversation continued with Daniel, explaining that Mr. Stone's building would be subject to immediate inspection and that any attempts to retaliate against tenants who had filed complaints would result in additional charges. When I hung up the phone, Mr. Stone looked like a man whose world was collapsing around him. "What do you want from me?" he asked. "I want you to stop violating housing laws," I replied simply. "I want you to refund the fraudulent utility charges you've collected from tenants. I want you to comply with fair housing regulations. And I want you to treat your tenants with the respect and dignity that the law requires. And if I don't, then you'll face the full consequences of federal housing violations, which can include criminal charges, asset forfeiture, and permanent prohibition from owning rental properties." Beth Martinez was crying now, clearly understanding that her involvement in Mr. Stone's schemes had exposed her to serious legal liability. "Mr. Stone," she said, "we need to get lawyers involved immediately. This isn't going away." That's when Mr. Stone made his final desperate attempt to regain control of the situation. "Victoria," he said, "what if we make a deal? I'll reduce your rent to what you were paying originally, and we can forget about all this legal stuff." "Mr. Stone," I replied, "this isn't just about my rent. This is about the dozens of tenants you've been defrauding and discriminating against for years. Those people deserve justice, and the law requires that you face consequences for your actions. But you could drop the complaints if you wanted to," he pressed. "Even if I wanted to, which I don't, I couldn't. Federal housing investigations don't stop because one tenant changes her mind. The Department of Housing and Urban Development is now aware of your practices, and they're required to pursue violations regardless of what individual tenants do." The truth was finally sinking in for Mr. Stone. His years of illegal practices, his aggressive treatment of tenants, and his belief that property ownership put him above the law had finally caught up with him. The papers I'd handed him contained evidence that would cost him his business, his properties, and potentially his freedom. "This is going to ruin me," he said quietly. "Mr. Stone," I replied, "you ruined yourself. I just documented it." The legal proceedings that followed Mr. Stone's confrontation in my apartment unfolded exactly as I'd predicted. Within 48 hours, housing inspectors had conducted surprise inspections of all 12 of his rental properties, uncovering safety violations, code infractions, and evidence of the systematic fraud I'd documented. The federal investigation expanded rapidly once HUD officials reviewed my research and began interviewing current and former tenants across Mr. Stone's properties. What they discovered was a pattern of violations so extensive that it prompted a multi-agency investigation involving the Department of Housing and Urban Development, the Seattle Police Department's Financial Crimes Unit, and the Internal Revenue Service. Mr. Stone's utility billing scheme alone had defrauded tenants of over $400,000 over 5 years, money that he'd failed to report as income on his tax returns, creating additional federal charges for tax evasion. The discriminatory rental practices violated the Fair Housing Act and exposed him to both criminal charges and civil liability for damages to affected tenants. Beth Martinez, his property manager, ultimately cooperated with federal investigators in exchange for reduced charges. Her testimony revealed the full scope of Mr. Stone's illegal practices, including systematic intimidation of tenants who questioned his practices and deliberate retaliation against anyone who filed complaints with city authorities. The criminal charges against Mr. Stone included wire fraud for the utility billing scheme, violation of the Fair Housing Act for discriminatory practices, tax evasion for unreported income, and racketeering for operating what prosecutors described as a systematic criminal enterprise targeting vulnerable tenants. The civil lawsuits filed by affected tenants resulted in settlements totaling over $2 million, money that had to be paid from the sale of Mr. Stone's rental properties. The federal government also seized several properties as proceeds from criminal activity, effectively ending Mr. Stone's career as a landlord. My own housing situation improved dramatically. The city of Seattle appointed a professional property management company to oversee Mr. Stone's building while legal proceedings were ongoing, and my rent was reduced to reflect legal market rates. More importantly, I was finally living in a building where tenant rights were respected and maintenance issues were addressed promptly. Kevin Park, my neighbor who had also been victimized by Mr. Stone's practices, received a settlement of $15,000 for the illegal rent charges and utility fees he'd been forced to pay. He used the money to move to a better apartment and started a tenant advocacy group to help other renters understand their rights. The most satisfying outcome was the systemic change that resulted from the investigation. Seattle's Housing Authority implemented new oversight procedures for rental property licensing, and several other landlords who had been using similar illegal practices voluntarily corrected their violations rather than face federal investigation. Susan Wright, my boss, used the Mr. Stone case as a model for pursuing systematic housing violations throughout the city. Our law firm's caseload expanded dramatically as word spread about our success in holding abusive landlords accountable for their actions. The case also had significant personal benefits for my career. My research and documentation skills, demonstrated through the Mr. Stone investigation, led to job offers from several larger law firms and eventually to a promotion to senior paralegal with Susan's practice, specializing in complex housing law cases. 6 months after that confrontation in my apartment, Mr. Stone was sentenced to 4 years in federal prison and ordered to pay $3.2 million in restitution to affected tenants. The judge specifically noted that Mr. Stone's systematic violations and his aggressive treatment of tenants who questioned his practices warranted the maximum sentence under federal guidelines. Beth Martinez received 18 months of probation and community service and was permanently banned from working in property management. Her cooperation with investigators had been crucial in exposing the full scope of Mr. Stone's criminal enterprise, but she still faced consequences for her participation in illegal practices. The building where I'd lived during this ordeal was eventually sold to a nonprofit organization that converted it to affordable housing for working professionals. I was offered the opportunity to stay at a significantly reduced rent, but I chose to move to a larger apartment in a building owned by a reputable management company. A year after Mr. Stone's sentencing, I received a letter from one of his former tenants, an elderly woman who had been particularly victimized by his discriminatory practices and fraudulent charges. She thanked me for having the courage to document his violations and pursue justice, saying that the settlement money she received had allowed her to move to a safe and affordable apartment where she was treated with dignity and respect. That letter reminded me why I'd chosen to specialize in housing law in the first place. Housing is a basic human need, and everyone deserves to live in safe, affordable conditions without being exploited by predatory landlords who view tenants as opportunities for profit rather than human beings deserving of respect. Looking back on that rainy Tuesday morning when Mr. Stone burst into my apartment demanding illegal rent payments, I realized that his aggressive behavior and dismissive attitude toward my legal documentation was actually the best thing that could have happened. If he'd read the papers I handed him and taken them seriously, he might have been able to negotiate some kind of settlement and avoid the full consequences of his actions. Instead, his arrogance and belief that property ownership put him above the law led him to continue his illegal practices even after being presented with evidence of federal violations. That decision cost him his business, his freedom, and his financial future. The papers he threw back at me that day contained more than just evidence of housing violations. They contained proof that knowledge, preparation, and courage can overcome even the most intimidating bullies. Mr. Stone thought he could intimidate me into compliance through aggressive behavior and threats, but he learned that some people can't be bullied when they know their rights and have the documentation to prove violations of those rights. Today, I continue working as a senior paralegal specializing in housing law, helping tenants across Seattle understand their rights and holding landlords accountable for legal violations. Every case I work on reminds me that the law exists to protect vulnerable people from exploitation, but only when someone has the knowledge and courage to enforce those protections. And every time I hand a landlord documentation of housing violations, I remember Mr. Stone's dismissive attitude toward my paperwork games, and how that attitude ultimately destroyed everything he'd built through years of illegal practices. Sometimes the most powerful weapon against injustice is a well-organized folder full of evidence and the knowledge to use it effectively.